I'm Stefan Baumann. Welcome to the Grand View. America's national parks through the eyes of an artist. During the 60s and 70s, palette knife paintings were really popular. And the people who used to buy a lot of palette knife paintings were motels. And you used to go to these really cheap motels, and over the beds they would have these really tacky palette knife paintings, and they kind of developed a really bad reputation. But the truth is, palette knife painting is awesome. And there are some artists who do it very well. Delhart Winberg is one of the artists. I mean, really exquisite. Clark Hewlings used a lot of palette knife. He's done some palette knife paintings in the past, but he used it pretty much all the time. Matt Smith, who's another artist who does plein air painting, he's even gone back home to go pick up his palette knife if he's forgotten. So palette knife painting can be really great. Now, I don't admire palette knife paintings when they look like they're palette knife paintings. So my key to my gauge for palette knife painting is that I want to walk up and say, oh, what a beautiful painting. And then go, oh my God, the artist used some palette knife in it. And if we look back at the old masters, like even Thomas Moran, he used palette knife painting quite a bit in his paintings, and you would just never guess it. Sometimes he would work a brush painting up to a certain point, and he liked using a lot of glazes. And he liked putting glazes on top of canvas to create kind of an underpainting for rocks. And oftentimes, if he overpainted an area, he would put palette knife painting back on top of the rock area with just white, let it dry, then glaze back on top of it. That's how you would get that luminescence to his rocks. So it's good for a foundation for that. What's nice about palette knife painting and oil painting is that when you have the textures of the canvas, which are pretty much porous, and then you put in something in palette knife, that surface, like if you have like the outside of a enamel doorway, it's shinier and it reflects more and it gives a whole different effect. So there are times when you can put them into an oil painting and it can kind of create an interesting effect. Other times there's certain things that you do that you can only get through palette knife painting. So if you do look like at a Clark Hewlings painting, those wonderful buildings that he did with all of the stucco on the outside, those were all done with palette knife painting, a palette knife, and you could not tell that they were palette knife painting until you were looking for it. So it's a good practice to do. Now, some people like Winberg, practically when you look at one of his palette knife paintings, you would go, is it palette knife or is it brush painting? And so with palette knife painting, you can create a lot of real interesting effects and blending and molding to make it almost look like it is a brush painting. So don't undersell palette knife. It can be really an interesting tool to use. Yeah.
Okay, I kind of had the idea that palette knife was supposed to be really thick, but you said it's okay to scrape it lightly and let the canvas show through.
Yeah, there are times when you put, and it is really effective. I mean, I have done palette knife painting in classes, and there are times when I have worked with students with palette knife, and whenever we've worked with palette knife, it looks awesome. There are times when it does look really good, and sometimes all of that really heavy texture is really effective on a painting. It's just that sometimes it can look really cheesy. So it just depends on personal taste. It depends on how you work your materials and the knife and how thick your paints are. But there are certain effects that you can only get with palette knife painting. Sometimes a little stumbling on rocks, like I said, the side of buildings. Sometimes in clouds, you can only get that effect with mixing with a palette knife. Now there's certain kinds of palette knives that you can buy. So if you go down to Michael's or Aaron Brothers, they have the real cheap palette knives. Usually they're like maybe $8. And for that you can either buy a little one, bigger. What?
It's funny you said about the motel. When I finished my painting, that's exactly what went through my mind. I think, well, this would be something you'd find in cheap motel.
Okay, so a couple of things first. Anne had mentioned something about using brushes and palette knife, and I prefer that effect. I prefer using some knife to my brush painting. I'm definitely a brush artist. I love my brushes. For me to go reach for a palette knife is kind of awkward, and then usually when I do, I go, oh, my palette knife.
They're
And
wonderful for certain effects.
They're wonderful for certain effects, but the problem is with palette knife is by itself is that you do have a tendency to want to use brush. And so Anne said, well, why couldn't we have used some brushes for this exercise? And this exercise was for you to practice palette knife all by itself, to find out what the limitations were of using a palette knife. You know, I can't have an exercise saying, okay, you're going to go home and you're going to add some palette knife to your painting, and then have you guys just paint like you normally do, and then scrape something off with a palette knife and say, well, I used a little bit of it. I scraped it off and redid my painting thing. So what I wanted you guys to do is to really play around with the palette knife for a bit. And guess what? It's not that easy. Artists who do really good palette knife painting, they do it all the time. They are palette knife artists and they're experts at it. In fact, if I grab a palette knife to start painting, it's awkward. And I have to play around with it for a little, get some permission for a while. I mean, most of you think that I can just grab anything and make it work. I just pretend to make it work. But oftentimes you'll see, like with Dottie's painting, I grabbed a fan brush and I started doing a fan brush, and you know that's an effective tool for certain things. But sometimes it's either the brush or the paint consistency, the wet on wet, the dry on dry, and I can go through 3 or 4 brushes, and then I and I went right back to the brush that we used before to try to get an effect. So it's not like you have total control. And the thing is with palette knife paintings is that, you know, most of you are not palette knife artists. And so you go down to Michael's, and especially beginning students, they'll go down to Michael's and I say, well, pick up a palette knife. Well, they'll go down and they sell these palette knives now that are made out of plastic. Oh my God, don't even buy them. They're stupid. They're not even, you can't mix anything. It's crazy. But you can buy a palette knife at Michael's, and usually they're like this. They're brown handled, or black handled, and they usually run about $8. And they're pretty hard. They're pretty stiff, and they feel like little pieces of metal attached to a piece of wood. And they're kind of palette knife-ish. Now, the difference, this is actually a painting knife. So whenever you have a knife that's bent like this, see that bent in there? That's a painting knife, okay? A palette knife is actually flat. Actually, it's a stick with a flat end at it. It just looks like a spatula. Those are pretty much palette knives. Now, they do have the bent spatulas. And the primarily reason why they have those is so that when you're mixing paint, it's a long, wide surface. And when you're mixing paint, you don't knock your knuckles into the paint. So that's why it's lifted like that. But the problem with that is that you end up having to mix up a lot of paint when you have a long spatula. And most artists, they pretty much work with 1 or 2 tools. So if they're mixing with palette knife, with a palette knife, they tend to take their painting knife and mix it with that. And you can get little tiny ones like this, or you can get larger ones.
Can I just
really big ones.
say that in my opinion, those flat ones are worthless.
The little tiny ones?
Yeah, the long.
Oh, the long flat ones.
Yeah.
Most artists don't.
The long
I have
ones.
one because it was like from the 1930s, and it's really nice, and it's got a mahogany handle, which is traditional. and I'm a snob, so.
Are you
Yeah.
using the words interchangeable, palette knife and painting knife? Is that the same thing?
Usually they're interchangeable, but if you really want to be on the know, a palette knife is a knife that you use for mixing on the palette. A painting knife is a knife that you use to paint. Usually painting knives have nice shapes to them and they're on a stick. Now if you watch Rob Ross, they have this flat knife with a cut at the end so that you can do that. Some of these palette knives have little ridges on them to do all kinds of little fancy scrapes and stuff like that. I mean, there's all kinds, and it just depends on what kind of painter you are. I've never gone into a lot of, I'm very much a traditionalist, so when I look at palette knives up on the wall, I ask myself, what would Manet have painted with, and what would Rembrandt have painted with? And those odd knives that they're selling in the stores, I don't necessarily drift towards, but I'm sure that a lot of people will say, hey, I can get a lot of technique out of that. Now those knives that you buy at Michael's for $8, they're kind of utilitarian. They're hard. They're unfriendly. So Holbein makes a whole nother knife. And they run you upwards of $50. They get 50, 60, 70 bucks. And they are like the most awesome knives in the world. And this is a Holbein knife.
How do you spell that, Stefan?
Stefan.
Holbein. Sometimes you can get them on Amazon.
I was like when they say, how do you spell that? And I go, T-H-E-T. But she said Stefan, so.
Now, is that a painting knife or a palette knife? in your
No,
hands?
this is a painting knife because it is,
Because it's bent.
it's bent and also it's not flat. It's not like this long flat thing. The palette knives look like spatulas.
Okay.
They're either flat, they go straight out like cake spatulas to decorate cakes with, or they'll have a bend in them, but they're still kind of flat. Usually your palette knives have the bend in them, and they have a kind of a surface, like a triangle or a rectangle or a diamond shape. Yeah, they're like pie things. The Holbeins, which are, if you're serious about painting, the only thing that really counts, now a lot of people go, oh, you gotta buy these paints. And okay, you gotta buy nice paints if you want to. But really the cheap ones will work, especially for a lot of beginning students. Brushes. That's where you spend your money. And if you ever painted with nice brushes, you can see, because that's the surface that hits your canvas. And if the brush isn't going to do what you want it to do, there's going to be your handicap. And the same thing with knives. You guys have no idea, and a lot of people when they come to classes, they go, well, I don't want to buy expensive brushes because I don't think I'm worthy. And I'm like, well, how do you know that if you had really good brushes, that might be the one thing that would actually make your work improve? If you had good canvases, that would improve your work. How do you know? If you paint on cheap canvases and trip and stumble because the paint is being absorbed into the cheap canvas and all this stuff. So having cheap supplies is crazy. And like we were talking earlier this morning, it's like, what'd you pay to go out to dinner? I mean, I went and bought 2 hamburgers and fries and a shake at McDonald's yesterday. It was over $21. And then I tell a student, I go, I know Molly's like, but I don't have a Molly home to cook for me. Huh?
We call them garbage burgers.
Garbage burgers. But the thing is though, is that you could spend $25 on, lunch for 2 at McDonald's, and where does that end up? But if you had $25 for a good brush, it might change the way that you paint forever. And so I recommend having good brushes, and if you're going to paint with knives, I suggest you try this before you give it up. You might try palette knife painting and absolutely hate it, but you might just love it if you had a Holbein. And I'm not being paid by Holbein. I wish I were. I wish I got something for free. I never get anything for free out of any paint company that I recommend. All I do is...
Does it have a spring in it? I mean, does it kind of...
Yeah, these
Flex.
actually are so flexible.
Okay.
And when you paint with them, they just mold and model. But the problem with them is that they are very, very sensitive. I have got lots of these. that are bent, broken. Even if you spend a lot of time just nicely working them, they'll start bending ever so slightly.
And that one's bent a little bit.
Yeah, so they do bend. The cheap ones you buy at Michael's, they don't bend. But that just shows you how sensitive these are. That these also will give you that really soft blending quality. You know, so you were saying you're having problems with just doing palette knife by itself, and it could be that it's not your problem at all. It's your knife.
That might have helped me,
That might have helped.
because I just feel like cutting.
It feels like it's cutting. And how can you like melt it? But the problem with these knives, the problem with these knives is if you drop one, it always ends this way. They're designed like a cat. Every time I drop one of these, it never drops this way, heavy side down. It always drops upside down like that. In your box, it is the one tool that will find the tip of your box and travel that way and bend. It is, aren't they? They're just horribly, horribly sensitive. And so now I have these knives in a special wooden box that I carry especially when I go outdoors to paint. You have to be very, 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 very careful with these knives. But consequently, they're very, very, very good at putting paint on the canvas. And I'd say if you had bad luck with painting with palette knife paints or doing palette knife painting, chances are it could be because your knife isn't really flexible and cooperative. And you almost need to have 4 or 5 knives, just like you need 4 or 5 brushes. You know, now one brush will work, especially at your beginning stage. The better you get, the more you can manipulate brushes. So some of you have actually seen me paint with one brush and be able to do everything with it. But there are certain things you need certain brushes for, and the same thing with the knives.
Do they come when you buy a $60 knife like that? Does it come with a box, in a box?
It comes, you know, they used to come and that's how special they used to be. They used to come in a velvet lined container that held this in a plastic box. So you could see that, and oftentimes you could put that, always put the knife back into this plastic box. What I would do is I would take the little holder that was inside the little cardboard holder that had velvet on it, and I would glue it to a bottom of one of those wooden boxes that had the top on it. So my knives sit in there, and I could put 3 knives in there using their little holder and gluing it into the bottom of the box and then putting the top on it, so I never had that problem. I mean, that's how careful you use these. And if you start using palette knives that are really high quality like this, you'll be like Matt Smith, where you'll be out on location, you go, oh my God, I don't have my knife with me, and you'll actually drive home, because there's certain things you need to do a palette knife with. So it should be part of your thing you use. And oftentimes when I say, you got a palette knife? Usually people are digging in their boxes looking for one. Now Molly's doing a complete palette knife painting right now. And it's a challenge, isn't it? But it's fun.
Oh, it's the last.
It is fun.
Say that
Okay.
with a smile.
But stay away from the plastic knives. Try to budget for a nicer knife from Holbein. They're the only company that really makes nice ones.
That's a whole binder, that's.
This is a Holbein that found
one
its
that
fate.
I've used it so much, I never dropped it, but I've used it a lot.
And you can feel it. It's got. Can we pass? Can I
Oh, we
trust?
pass that one around, sure.
Pass this one. This one's already bent. I'm not going to pass the good one because
You
if
might
that.
have read them.
This knife probably. Do you remember what you paid for this knife?
I got it at Weber, so it was probably like $60.
$60. Yeah. And Winberg uses Holbeins. Yeah. You know, it's all about the tools. And so this is about $60 for a knife. And when you drop 2 of these, you start really taking
Yeah.
good care of them
Give it
because they're really
respect for
expensive.
them.
But you could feel how absolutely like you run your hands over it. Now they shouldn't have that wave in them, but that's just from her using it.
Mike Winberg actually will heat that knife up to where it's red and then put heavy, heavy stuff on it and it'll flatten it right back out.
I should send them to him. I should
It's
try that.
thinner than paper.
Try that.
Yeah, it's
It
thinner
will
than
cut
paper.
you, it will cut you.
Yeah, that's another thing with knives. I've had students that have had their same knife all of their career, 30, 40 years, and the edges are so sharp, they're like a knife. Because when every time you're working on a palette knife, you know, on a palette or on a canvas, it's like sandpaper. And I've had palette knives, this is why you have to really watch out. I've borrowed, I've never used a palette knife this long, but I have used their knife and I've wiped off the knife. This is usually what you do, and it had gone right through the paper and right onto my hand. It was like a razor blade. They had gotten so sharp. So yeah, these ones could do it if you use them long enough.
The word knife isn't lost on those, huh?
Well, yeah, the word knife is not. Well, if you think about it, pigment is nothing more than, you know, granulated sand, which is like sandpaper. And if you keep going across it, you can sand the edges, and they could be like a leaf left in your studio. So, anyway, so I do recommend doing that. And we'll take a look at some of what the students have done. Now, one of the things that I recommended, and I talked to Bonnie about this earlier, the homework assignments are really a crucial part of this class. If you really want to learn how to paint, doing the homework assignments is really the golden key to doing these. But you've got to really set yourself up to do that. You've got to, some of you that do homework all the time, you do that because you go home, you've got your box, you know, you don't set your sights up too high, you don't put up a lot of expectations. It's more of the practice than anything else. So what you want to do when you go home to go paint is look for the objects or the things that I tell you to do. Or if you go home to set up the still life, the whole key is for you to practice, not set up the still life. Don't spend a lot of time looking for the most ideal thing. If you go home and I say go home and do a palette knife painting, only using a palette knife, keep your subject kind of simple and traditional. Keep your subject simple and traditional. Don't get too complicated with it. The whole idea is that you get it done this week. Some students that I have, they literally spend all week designing their painting, and then now they're a week behind because we're moving on to something else. And then what happens is they start putting more into it for the other homework assignments, and you've done this too, where it's like, oh, well, this is those homework, and you start adding other homework assignments into it. Don't do that. It's not about trying to catch up on one painting. It's about trying to just do the homework assignments right now. So if you haven't done the palette knife painting, don't do the next homework assignment and include palette knife painting as that. Now we've moved on to something else. The whole idea is to keep up with the homework assignments. If you miss one, just move on, because every week we have a new homework assignment, we move on. We can't stay in the past. Some of the people I mentor on the phone, all of a sudden will say, well, I went back and did. Don't go back and do some of the homework assignments that are back there. You know, we constantly have to move on. Don't redo any of the homework assignments. Just because you saw Dottie do an excellent job and you want to go home and redo it because you want to match Dottie's painting, it's like, no, that's a waste of time. We're moving on to something else. The key to it is to be part of the conversation, come in, and even if you have a dog, you provide insight into what not to do, into the problems that you had in producing that, why it failed, and people learn from the paintings that did not turn out. So whose is this?
It's mine, Patty Marie.
So what were you thinking?
That it looked like a blog in a motel. Actually, I didn't have time, so I rushed through it a bit, but I sent my husband to get the fruit, so he came back with not what I would have picked, like the apple was like too red and the pear was too green. But that's okay, because then I had to just work with what was in front of me to work with, and so I just did the best I could, even though it was very hard for me, and it was way out of my comfort zone and out of the box and everything, so.
Well, when you're working way out of the comfort zone, all what that is doing is putting you in a place where you learn.
Yeah, right.
So if you feel like you're drowning, that's the best place to be. You have to be out of control.
Yeah.
If you're not out of control, you're not learning anything new.
That's how I felt, like, how do I do this? But it was
You
fun.
laugh, but it's true. Is that how you felt too?
That's how I felt when I was doing it with no brush, just.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a
Um,
challenge, it was fun though.
Yeah, no, it's awesome. Actually, this does look like you'd see in a cheap motel. The thing
Look like what?
that you would see in a cheap motel, you know, like motel, not not like Motel 6, like the Regency for roadway inns and steakhouse.
It's
you know.
almost like the velvet paintings.
Yeah, almost like. But the thing is, your husband went and found really bright apples and greens and stuff. But those are the quintessential things. I mean, why wouldn't you want to have an apple that was really red or a
Right.
pear that's really green?
Right.
I mean, that's like, if I go to the store, I want quintessential things. I don't want to have grapefruit.
Right.
So he
Well,
did a good job, and he was doing you a favor. So cut it
He did.
close.
He did?
Most husbands don't care.
Oh, no, he was
I
right
have to
on,
go to
it
the
was
grocery
very
store.
cool, he came back with a bunch of new
It's the
stuff.
best.
So where's your central focal point?
It's actually on the left side of the nectarine, but it ended up being like right smack dab in the middle of the paint, which I didn't really want to happen, but it kind of.
Yeah. Where should it have been the central focal point?
Where should
If
it
you
have
had
been?
another choice.
Probably maybe like where the hole in the,
Here?
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe there.
Well, the thing is, these should have been moved over to
Yeah.
there.
Right.
So that, because if the light's coming from this direction, you want the light to be over here.
Yeah.
Remember, our highlight is always the opposite side of the direction that the light comes
Right.
in. That's where you want to center focal point, preferably on one of the thirds. Okay, if you're doing
So I
something.
didn't get that right.
The foreground, here again too, palette knife has a tendency where you feel like, oh, I've got a pile of paint on.
Yeah.
And you don't, if you had a nice soft palette knife, you could have blended some of these, a lot of these hard edges. And that's one of the things that we've learned is that your central focal point is the only place that you have a hard edge. And a palette knife has a tendency to want to give you hard edges. Now, if you're using a combination of brushes and palette knife, you could go in and soften those edges.
You can also use your finger.
You can also use your finger, but
Except
that's
this
not a
is
I
palette knife.
started to
Right.
use my fingers, oh.
Nope, you gotta stay out of it. The whole exercise
Right, I
is
almost
this.
did, but I knew I couldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I didn't give you any permission to use any brush, but if you're going to do an entire palette knife painting, the first thing you want to do is tone the canvas and actually paint the canvas in brush. That's what I would recommend. Because what happens is that you start getting all of those little pinpoints of the canvas showing through. And most of you, did you realize that when you were painting it and all of a sudden it didn't cover all the canvas? Because you have a hard edge going across all of the pores of the canvas. And so they show up white, and then you tend to want to dig paint into those. And in the process of trying to cover up all the little white spots, you start getting muddy paintings and soft edges and too much paint and yada, 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 right?
Actually, I had toned it all in sienna or something.
Yeah, you could tone
first.
it all in sienna, and if I have students that say, I want to do this all in palette knife, I go, just paint it in brush first. So put in the darks where they are, lights where they are, the grays and the blues, and actually go through, but don't put in any detail or anything like that. But get those areas covered with color. So like if you had a brown background, you can go over it and some of the canvas is showing through, you're not feeling like you have to like ruin, because a lot of the palette knife painting is happy accidents. Because you'll do things with palette knife, you're like, oh, that's nice, and you can only do it once. And if you go back in and try to do it again, it goes away. How many of you
I
realize
found
that?
that,
right?
yes. I
Yeah, you
found
had
that.
something that worked, and then you thought, oh, I gotta like take that edge out of there, and then you go back in and all of a sudden, everything is gone again.
It happened.
So I suggest to tone the canvas. And you can see where the canvas is showing through. If those were white, they would be real obvious, and then you go
Yeah.
back in and you might ruin some of this nice blending. The thing behind doing palette knife painting is a combination of soft edges and hard edges. But when you do a lot of this hard edge like this, it starts looking too much, too textured.
Yeah.
You know, when I see paintings like Sigmund Freud, Lucian Freud's paintings, when I saw them in the book, I thought, wow, these are ingenious, they're wonderful. But then when I saw them in real life, some of the textures were so overwhelming that he used I mean, to the point that he had sand in his paint and really thick paint, so he liked to really tear things apart and repaint them. And, you know, in some of the areas of like 1/4 of an inch, that sometimes I felt that the texture distracted from the message. And they looked a lot better in reproduction than they actually did in real life. When I got far enough back, it kind of all came together. But usually in a gallery situation, if you get too much texture, it gets to be too distracting. And when I'm looking at this and I'm going, oh, look at how this, oh, I like that texture over here. I'm talking about the texture now, not about the painting. And that's usually the problem with most palette knife paintings. And then it starts looking kind of cheap, as we talked about. So this is great, because it's best to have more texture in the light areas and close to no texture in the shadow areas. So if you have light in here, this is great. This is where palette knife painting is awesome. If you can't get light on something in a painting, throw some palette knife highlights in, because that texture will catch light. But the problem is when you start putting lots of texture in your shadow, that catches light too, and it has a tendency to flatten. So these start to compete with these. So one of the secrets behind palette knife painting is to make sure your shadow areas are non-textured. And so simplify those, make those thin. And remember, the thinner the paint, the darker it appears. The thicker the paint, the effect causes light. So thick paint like this reflects light in a room. So if you have light in the background here, and you silhouetted the dark, there would be no texture here, and then really thick paint on the back to illuminate the back of that, so you get some contrast. You have no checkering. Both sides of this painting are completely the same. There's no transition. Transition is key to doing any painting. If the light's coming this way, I want to see this dark in here. Thin. No texture.
Then going to light.
Just really push down. And then your light against that. So now the texture of thin to thick, now you've got the feeling, two separate feelings of virtually no to texture. You'll create the actual effect of the mountain instead of the mountain competing with the sky. There's a good time to have texture and a bad time to have texture. Okay?
So if you're trying to set something back in the distance, you want less.
Less texture in the distance
And more
too.
towards the front.
So you want less texture back here and more in the front. See, so it's not just, oh, let's go crazy and put paint everywhere.
And that's what I did.
But see, this is a homework assignment. So Beverly, see, it's not about getting, oh Bonnie, it's not about getting it right. It's just getting it. And then in the process, we discover what works and what doesn't work. And then if you want to paint one at home and try it, you're more than welcome to do it. We can talk about it in class, but we'll move on to something else. But here, I would have loved to have seen no texture, darker value here. More texture here, light, and then almost no texture here, shadow. Maybe texture here where the light's hitting the other side of the mountain, because we're not getting that effect of that light hitting that.
Yeah.
Because this is competing with all of this in here. So if this were flat and thin and dark, and then we're light, then we could put dark light in this sky back in here, and then with our checkering, I would have put dark right in here to bring that forward. Nothing in the sky would have that much texture. In fact, a good way to work on doing clouds, because sometimes clouds can be kind of difficult, and if you ever see those really bright, lighted cumulus clouds where the center of it just looks brilliant, and the rest of it is kind of in shadow, you know, that contrast like that, like before a thunderstorm. That area of light, go ahead and paint it in, and then swap it with a palette knife, and that texture, that flat texture, illuminates with the light in the room, and it just glows. And just the brush against that flat area, you create the effect of that light just illuminating up a cloud.
Well, it gives you depth and perception too, doesn't it?
Mhm.
The palette
It does,
against
yeah,
that.
exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and just like having texture in the front and no texture in back, those little subtleties make a big difference. If you look at Moran's paintings and you look for where he used the palette knife, or you look at Clark Hillings, you look where he used the palette knife, you'll see that they always have used it to create an effect. It's always about effects. They're not about painting things. So sometimes the effects can be just within a painting to create lights and shadows. Texture and no texture. In a palette knife painting, the no texture is as important as the area that you have texture. See, aren't you glad you did palette knife painting?
All in our world.
So, who wants to take credit for this?
Nobody.
Who are you?
Jackie.
Jackie. Remember, we always want to say your
Yeah, Jackie.
Jackie. So what were you thinking?
Well, I was thinking I was having a lot of fun. It was like decorating a cake, just spreading that stuff around. But then I was thinking, my gosh, I'm using so much paint. But I had fun, and I like it, even if it looks like a hotel picture. It's definitely too many hard edges, just from what you've been saying. I forgot about my edges, so it's too many hard edges, but I had fun.
Well, that's part of painting. Fun is its middle name. So that's good. First thing, you did fabulous. It's wonderful. And it shows that you were having fun. I wanted to see how simple just doing one item is. It doesn't have to be really complicated. Notice that the light's coming this way. This is what I was telling Dolly about her mountain. See, the light's coming this way. Notice the dark's over here. And then this gets dark, and notice how that's light. This is checkering 101.
I don't understand that.
Huh?
I don't understand that because the lighting is in the back, but it's so dark there, so how are you getting the lighting there? It doesn't go through the bear.
No, it goes right. It's going past that, hitting the wall.
But you don't see that, like, doing like that. Like,
What do you do?
I mean, through the dark.
Well, this is the cast shadow. The light just happens to be lit like this. And then this is the dark. Now, the great thing about painting in general, or any kind of art like this, is that you can manipulate light and shadow however. This is why it's important to know the rules. So when I talk about doing checkering or transition, and it's not happening in your painting, you should know enough about painting that you make that happen. And that's why we have these talks. Because for the most part, when you're looking at a painting, or a photograph, you don't see those happening. You could see the light on the wall because that's the light. And that makes total sense. But almost every Rembrandt that you see, you'll see the face lit up, the right side of the face will be lit up, the wall on the dark side will actually be there to silhouette the object itself. And this is really, really simple. And so it's dark to light, light to dark. And when do you do that? You choose it whenever you can. You choose those effects. So I would bet that wasn't happening in your subject matter.
But that's one thing I've learned from you while I've been painting with you, is this light and dark area. So I added more light to the dark side of the pear.
Yeah.
Because I knew I would get that effect.
Yeah, and so that's how you do get that effect. And then she transitions back into shadow again. And did you question that when you first saw it?
What are you talking to me?
Yeah. Bonnie, did you?
No, I just couldn't, when you were talking about it, and I know you said the opposite, but like to me it seemed like it would have been in the front, not the
But
back.
you didn't notice it. And so
I mean, I noticed the dark shadow on the back of this.
yeah, so you see the dark shadow in the back, you see the light in here, and then this. But the thing is, if it's done correctly, you would never notice that. The thing that happens is that this can get really complex. She could actually darken this area in here and highlight like a reflective light onto the pear and back and forth. But that wasn't the homework assignment. She just threw that effect in. And the only reason why we're talking about checkering right now is that lo and behold, it's in your face. I mean, it's so simple. You can see dark, light, you know.
That's
And
called
so,
checkering.
Yeah, it's called checkering. But we get really complex. We can actually go dark here, light there, dark there, light there, and go back and forth. And that's why I call it checkering. I don't know what it's called. That's just the name I make up, because it's usually like a checkerboard, and it switches back and forth. Red and black, red and black, red and black. This is light and dark, light and dark, light and dark. Likewise, she could have gotten light on the table and dark in this part, and so it wouldn't be so plain. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about night. But also the transition is correct. That shadow going out into light, that is correct. The thing that makes this kind of a little bit cheesy is that all of the knife marks are all the same. But
I thought that was one thing I was supposed to do, was to make all the knife marks show, but now, knowing what you said, I would go smooth that dark area
smooth
out.
the dark areas out and
Yeah.
blend some of that a little bit. But it's really beautiful. I mean, this is really a nice job.
It was
Perfect.
fun.
Yeah. And the thing is, you cannot get this bright, light color with a brush. You could try all you want. This boom in your face is, you can only get it with a palette knife. So, it's just because we're short of time. Whose is this?
Mercedes.
Okay. So with Mercedes, you can see these are really sweet. The problem with these is that we're always looking for a central focal point. Every one of these tomatoes are like saying, look at me, look at me, look at me. So, and then the pear goes, I can't compete. All the same color. You know, this should have been dark to light. It's too, there's no transition. There's always a transition from top to bottom, warm to cool, light to dark. Okay, same thing here, light to dark. So, and then one center focal point, they should have been more in shadow. When you have a cast shadow, it's darker at the base and then lighter as you get to the outside. Here you would mesh the palette knife and soften the edges a little bit and kind of do a little bit of blending. If you're doing a brush painting, you would start putting in a brush, a little softer brush stroke. My God, look at all the homework assignments. Okay, who's this?
Becky.
Becky.
Like that.
So what I see with your painting here is you're recreating the effect of the orange by using the palette knife and actually dabbling. And that can be effective to a point. Now normally when you see an orange or any other object, usually the texture is in the transition between the highlight and the shadow. Usually in that area where it's the most orange, that's where you would have the texture. You usually don't see texture where the highlight is, it's usually flat. And usually in the shadow, it's usually flat. And you don't have so much texture here, so you actually have that. If the light's coming this way, the cast shadow should be more dramatic.
That's
If the light is hitting here, notice how kind of chalky this is. This needed to be warm. This needed to have a little bit more shadow behind here. Because remember, with chalkiness, it's because you don't have enough cool next to the warm and vice versa, so there's a bit more shadow in there. I would have brought in more shadow into this area in here. I would have get the feeling that the light's a little bit more concentrated. The background is boring because both of these triangles here are exactly the same color. So always try to have anything on this side be a different color than that side. So it's just, it's not that you did a bad job with the overall effect, it's just that you just didn't quite use some of our rules as big as we want to. Okay, this is pretty much, it feels like a painting of an orange. Which is yeah. But the thing is, we don't want to have things, we want to have effects. So I'm going to go, wow, look at that highlight on that. Now, oh, it's an orange. You know, it should be secondary to the effect of light. For last, whose is this?
Mary.
Mary. Good. Here again too, flat. We should go from dark to light, get the viewer focused in here. Yeah, I'm not sure what the center focal point is. I think this is supposed to be the center focal point here, but it's trying to compete with all of the other objects. Too many things